area, in Atlanta, even in Dallas-Fort Worth, in Phoenix, in Las Vegas, and yet you probably never heard of any of them. The one you finally got to hear about a week ago was when USA Today and then some of the networks suddenly mentioned the thing in Phoenix. Now my question is, why was the Phoenix sighting news a week ago, but it wasn't news on March the 13th when it actually happened? That's 3 months that went by, and you weren't told about it. And then all of a sudden it's mentioned, and I'll tell you why it was mentioned. And this gets to how you break up this logjam. Because in the intervening 3 months, it was all over the internet, number one. Number two, then it made it to the tabloid TV. Sightings and strange universe, and they're all carrying, and if you looked at it, and I caught some of those segments on that, and some of them were journalistically good pieces. They told you what happened. One of them had more than a dozen people there in their studio, witnesses who were saying, here's what it looked like, you know, da-da-da-da-da. They showed the videotape. Several of the videotapes remained of this object. And it was a perfectly legitimate news story. But it was on tabloid TV. And all of a sudden now the regular networks and the national news is suddenly shamed into covering this thing. But even at that, most of you people, friends and neighbors, you know, they'll say, well, I heard something about that thing over in Phoenix. You know, I guess those people have been drinking that cactus juice or something, you know. They don't understand the context of this whole issue because they haven't been told about all these other places. They haven't been told that in Mexico, over about the past 2 years, there's been just an incredible ongoing wave of UFO activity, with TV stations and even the networks down there carrying it to a great degree. They aren't being told that this thing has been going down in Brazil, which by many accounts even involves landing and confrontation with humanoid objects. Don't get told about that. You may vaguely recall that a year ago, a big triangular shaped thing with bright lights, very similar to what's been described over Phoenix, was seen over Belgium. Is it the same craft? You know, are the Europeans testing the same thing we're testing? Or is the ship from somewhere, you know, visiting around the globe? You know, we don't know because the news media is not telling you. The non-existent news media is falling down on the job, okay? And again, please understand the way this happens. It's in the control of the distribution of the information. And this is where outfits like MUFON could really come in handy. I don't know what, if any, efforts y'all are doing in this area, but there really needs to be some credible national group that would keep tabs on all this and would present it to the news media, because obviously they're too lazy or controlled to do the work on their own. But one of the ways we'll learn about the alien agenda is by simply learning what's going on and putting these stories together and seeing what takes place. Now, where the syncopathic news media does try to, boy, they do a tremendous job, is passing along disinformation. 3 years ago or 4 years ago, whenever it was, when Doug and Dave cropped up, okay? If you go back again and put the whole thing in context, back into the 70s, most people had never even heard of this crop circle. And then finally into the late 80s, though, they kept building, and more and more people were paying attention to them. And they were hitting in those alternative publications. And now you get on the internet, and there was people putting these photographs of these incredible crop circles out, and all of a sudden it was beginning to impinge on the mass consciousness. Well, just about the time that it was about to, you know, everybody's about to go, hey, wait a minute, what is with these crop circles? All of a sudden we're inundated with stories about Doug and Dave, two old pub crawlers from England who, over a period of years, had gone out at night, you know, after having a few pints, and they got themselves a string and a board, and they went out there, and they just, one of them stood in the middle, and the other tromped down the stuff, and they made a circle. Well, is that possible for them to do that? Of course. But did they do that? Absolutely not. And here again is when the media falls on their face. All they had to do was stop and check for 1995, I guess it was, or 94, whenever Doug and Dave came forward. If they had simply checked, they would have found that more than 2,000 crop circles were reported not only in England, but in Canada and the United States and Australia, just in that one growing season. Boy, Doug and Dave sure got around, didn't they? And it's that simple. All I had to do was just check, and it was physically impossible for these two guys to have done all that. Well, here comes the debunkers, though. They go, yeah, well, there's a few copycats. You know, a few people thought, well, that's fun. We'll just go do that. Of course, I don't know. Maybe it's fun to somebody, but I can think of many things I'd rather do at night rather than go out and stomping around in a field with a board, you know. But again, the news media falls flat on their face, because even if you could show that it was theoretically possible for Doug and Dave and maybe about 2,000 copycats to go out and do these circles, we find that, well, when they go out and they stomp down a circle with a board and with other implements, that just as you would naturally think, they kill the crop. They break the stems, they break the leaves, the thing's crushed to the ground, it's dead, okay? And that's what happens when you crush down crop. You don't believe me? You know, go out to some cornfield, stomp down a 4-foot circle, break all those stems, and see what happens. Within a couple of days, you're going to have a dead circle right there, because it's dead. So the news media, though, can't seem to take that one little step to go, well, now, wait a minute, though. In the crop circles, in the majority of the crop circles, and the ones that most everybody say is a legitimate crop circle, the crop is not killed. It's laid over at a 90-degree angle, and it will not rise back up, but it will continue growing horizontally. And they find that at the cellular level, there is evidence of brief but intense heat, as you might find from a microwave. And it has softened those tissues, and that's why the stalk will not grow again, will not rise up. It doesn't have it's the same thing when you put a nice crisp piece of toast in your microwave, and you microwave it, when you take it out, it's like a pancake. It's all flabby, okay? That's what microwaves does. And they can't, and this has been shown by not one, but several scientists have all found this same phenomenon. And the news media can't seem to understand this? No. We get Carl Sagan, bless his dear heart, who writes a piece for Parade magazine, which is distributed to probably the majority of homes in this nation, and all he can talk about is Doug and Dave. Carl Sagan doesn't understand that there's cellular changes taking place. I submit that he did. I think he knew that. He had his own agenda, and what it was, I'm not sure what. But it's real easy to go back and see that early in his career, Carl Sagan, as a young man, was quite open-minded and had some pretty radical ideas. He, along with a Russian scientist, came out and said that one of the moons of Mars was probably an artificial satellite. All right? And he was talking about life in outer space, and he was talking about all that stuff. It was only after he became the premier public scientist in this nation that he suddenly backed up and kept saying, well, it would be great if all that's there, but we know it's not there. And he parroted the mindset that we've all been subjected to. And personally, I just would like to think that he was a better scientist than that. So he had an agenda. Well, what is this agenda? All right, well, let's start with our own government's agenda. If you go back prior to July of 1947, you'll find that the United States government official position towards UFOs was pretty open. They said there are these things, they're real, they are not fictitious or hallucinations. We're not sure what they are. We think they may be secret Soviet weapons that they're testing, but if not, then there is a possibility they could be craft from another world. That was the official position. But all that changed in July of 1947. And what happened in July of 1947? Roswell. After Roswell, this immediately changed. In fact, just 2 months after Roswell, we saw President Truman institute our modern national security state. He created the CIA, he created the National Security Council. Now, let me hasten to add that this was not necessarily a crash, suddenly a crash thing. Talk about consolidating the intelligence services into one, talk about separating the Air Force from the Army had been going on since World War II. But all of a sudden, within 2 months of Roswell, it's a crash priority and it happens. Now, let's think about what creating the National Security Council did. First off, does anybody know who sits on the National Security Council? Who is the National Security Council? Hey, it's no big secret. All it is, the president, the vice president, the joint chiefs of staff, the head of the CIA, and that's about it. A couple other fellows, they go along with what everybody says. Well, what's the purpose of this? Well, national security. Anything that's national security comes under the National Security Council, and they make the decisions. Well, think about it, folks. What did this do? What this did was bypass the normal, traditional, constitutional lines of authority and communication. It bypassed the Congress. It bypassed the news media, and it bypassed the public. Because now if it's national security, it's under the National Security Council, and that's all anybody knows about it. And that's why even ranking congressmen like Barry Goldwater, when he tried to ask Curtis LeMay about UFOs and wanted to know if he could go see the bodies in the craft, he not only was told no, but hell no, cussed out by a man who should have been subordinate to him as a ranking senator, and told never bring that subject up again. What I found most interesting about that whole scenario was that Curtis LeMay didn't say, oh, that's all just crap. There's nothing there. He never said that. He just said, don't ever bring that up again. That shows the deep secrecy that takes place. Well, now then, and that's what's instituted. So with the creation of the modern national security state, UFOs went totally underground, totally undercover, and the official government position shifted from this openness to one of dismissal and ridicule. You didn't see anything because there's nothing there, but I saw it. No, you didn't. We're the government, And I've seen this in researching the Kennedy assassination. People who were standing in Dealey Plaza and heard with their own ears and saw with their own eyes were told by the government, you were mistaken. Who are you going to believe? Your government or your own lying eyes? And that sounds pretty funny. But it's the truth. It's the way they operate. And that's the way they've operated on the UFO issue for years. And it's been pretty effective. Because that ridicule, that dismissal, has seeped down from the government to the news media. And we're still fighting that to this very day. And that's why we don't know more today than we do. But I'll give you some encouraging news. In my little recent travels around the country with the national news media, I was in the headquarters of NBC, CBS, CNN of New York, and I want to tell you something. There is a growing interest and seriousness that's being taken on the part of a lot of people within the news media. I don't know if y'all happened to catch it, but they had an interview with this fellow Weaver that wrote the government's Roswell report. And I remember George Will was on the panel and several of these mainstream media hacks. And they gave him fits. They really did. They're saying, you expecting us to believe this, And they had him squirming. Now that's interesting, because that means the media now is beginning to take a serious look at this whole thing, as we have for years. All right, so now we know they're real. We know there's been a big conspiracy to cover the whole thing up in this country. Just go read Alan Hynek's work. He started off as a very skeptical disbeliever, working with the Operation Blue Book, and before the end of his life, he had established his own UFO group and was totally committed to trying to say that it's real and there's stuff going on. Okay, so let's look. We know that something's going on. So who are they? What do they want? Well, now, up till now, I've been dealing with the stuff that's pretty much fact, documented. The fact that the government's hid away this stuff for years is no secret. Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, on several occasions has told that back in the 50s he was with a team of photographers who photographed the landing of a UFO on a U.S. air base. This film was turned over to the government, and in fact we find it listed in the indices of Project Blue Book, but it's not there. Now there's prima facie evidence of a government cover-up right there. They've got this stuff, but they hide it away and they won't tell anybody about it. So right now, up until this point, we're on our own trying to figure out what is the alien agenda. We know they're real. Now I'm going to freely admit, Dave, take note. Now I'm getting into some speculation, okay? I'm getting into some speculation because I'm not here to tell you that this is honest to God fact. It is honest to God fact that they're real, they're tangible, they're real objects. It is also a fact that our government, or people within our government, I'm not talking about your postal carrier, or, you know, the guys that mails you the food stamps. I'm talking about people at the top of the food chain, okay? These people up there know a whole lot more about it than they're talking about. And I'll tell you another thing, too, is that they try to hark up science to these. Well, scientists don't read this stuff. In researching alien agenda, I've got a drawer full of serious scientific papers published in serious scientific journals where they are talking quite seriously about extraterrestrials, life on other worlds, contact, a quarantine of this planet. In fact, I'll tell you a brief little story. You can say I'm misreading this, and I may be, but I don't think so. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I have been in contact for several years now with a scientist who is working on energy, and energy that I have seen described in the accounts of abductees. And it really made me wonder, is this just synchronicity? Is this guy just happen to be working on this type of energy that these abductees just happen to be mentioning? Or did they read his scientific papers, or did he read their accounts? Or is this an example of where the government knows things and they're working on it and trying to come to? I wrote him a letter recently and sent him a copy of the alien agenda, and I just flat told him, I said, as far as I know, of everybody I'm in contact with, you're probably the one guy who, if there is serious scientific study of extraterrestrials and their craft, you're probably one of the guys I know that's probably involved in that. I said, now I know that you probably can't or won't tell me yes or no or talk to me about that. I said, but how about giving me some kind of hint? You know, how about just telling me, keep investigating, you know? or a simple, you know, you're totally wrong, go do something else. That'd be all right. Well, just day before yesterday, in the mail comes a letter from this scientist, and in there is a copy of his latest scientific paper that was published in I can't remember, I couldn't tell you now, I had to, but it was published in a very prestigious scientific publication, and it's all about how that the latest research in energy and in quantum physics shows that it is entirely possible to exceed the speed of light, and that it is entirely possible for these wormholes, as they call them, to be used to zap ships across the galaxy and to compress the immense amount of distances that would be necessary to come from one interstellar system to another. And as he himself points out, whether by our use in the future or by some advanced extraterrestrial civilization. Interesting, huh? Now, like I said, I could be misinterpreting this, but to me, that sounds like a response to the question. Okay? However, I fully understand why somebody with this fellow's prestige, or why somebody that's a politician, or why somebody that's that's actually involved in this stuff, secrecy oaths aside, certainly